Welcome back to another episode of The Summer of Me. I am with Nitro Nana, it's who you guys all know and love. If you are new to the podcast, Nitro Nana is my mom. We affectionately call her Nitro Nana because she doesn't know how to stop. We say she's like a shark. She'll die if she stops moving. Anyways, my mom is here with us today and we're super excited. She is a family, marriage, anxiety, all-around therapist. Of all sorts. You've been doing therapy for
20 plus years.
20 plus years. She has a practice in the Seattle area, and we do what we call group therapy here on the podcast. So I think this is like the third or fourth time we've done group therapy, and it is basically you guys submitting questions or me kind of playing. Have you guys seen where AI does this, where it basically like you'll like search something online and then it just like sums it up for you, like this is what all the customer reviews are saying. So I play AI sometimes and I just like sum up all of your questions into like a handful of them. And so we're just going to talk about some generalized concepts and then there's some specific questions. So today we're going to mostly be talking about anxiety and boundaries, two things that come up very often. If you want to go back in the podcast archives, we have an episode on marriage and then we also have an episode on grief. So those two episodes have tons of information. They are rich with just like helpful tips and resources for you to use if you're going through those things. But today we're going to talk about anxiety first, and then we'll kind of get into boundaries. But before we get into that, some people are like well-versed in therapy. We obviously grew up, whether it was like around therapy, in therapy, whatever, like therapized therapized to the sky. Is therapized a word?
Should be.
But some people are like, I don't need therapy, or I hate therapy, or I don't want to go to therapy, or I would love to go to therapy, but I don't even know how the fuck to find somebody, or I can't afford therapy. There's a million avenues, right? So I guess the first question that I would love to ask is like, how, if you're telling somebody, I think we've touched on this before a little bit briefly, but like somebody saying, I want to go to therapy, how do I find somebody that specializes in, you know, if you're going through divorce or, you know, whatever.
So just as a general rule, I would always go to psychologytoday.com because they have drop-down menus for what your issue is, whether they take your insurance, what area. And then you can sort of look through each person's profile. So that's one
online dating for therapists.
One way to do it. It's where a lot of the insurances also will direct you. So and I always tell my clients the very first visit, if it doesn't feel right, then tell me. And I'll help you find somebody if I know somebody like in my building or whatnot. But don't give up on therapy because honestly, a big part of therapy is really connecting to the person that you're working with. And don't make it work. If it doesn't feel right after, especially after like, 3 visits even, or if it doesn't feel right the first time, but certainly after 3 visits still doesn't feel right, move on. Don't give up on therapy, just move on.
Yeah. And then another question that came up, and I think this is important. People ask this all the time, and I think this is a stigma around therapy. Is like, well, then you're just like in therapy for the rest of your life. You uncover these issues you don't really need to uncover, and like, a lot of people feel like it's like, a trap or a crock of shit or whatever. Somebody asked this, and I think this sums it up perfectly. Do people graduate from therapy? Would you say it's like an isolated thing, or like, how do you approach that?
So I think. I also will tell people it's their job to tell me when they are kind of done. I joke I can get my shovel and go digging and find a lot of stuff, but I tend to be personally, and I think therapy is as unique to the therapist as it is sometimes, the person that's walking in. But I would say this is that I'm a solution-focused therapist. I tend to I don't mind looking at your past, but I want to really see how it's relevant today and then move forward. And so I want to see progress with people just because it's a lot of money and a lot of time and investment. And so I do think people, quote, graduate, but I don't think it's the therapist's job to say when that is. I think a patient will, like for me,
and people are like, I don't want to hurt my therapist's feelings.
Well, that's worth dealing with in therapy about the fact that you're codependent.
You're codependent.
Yes. And so I say to people oftentimes, they're here to work on an issue. I will help them, with sort of their subconscious or, the parts that they don't recognize. But they may go away and come back. I saw a kid last week that I hadn't seen in 4 years. So it depends on the person.
Yeah.
But if a therapist is making you feel like you have to stay in therapy, that's about them, not about you. So, really, some people do stay in therapy because it's sort of like peeling an onion. They go from the big issues in, and I think that's okay.
If you want to do that.
But if that's your personality, or if that's not my personality is, I want to get in, I want to deal with issues head on as I can. And, but
that's been my experience. I feel like I didn't do therapy for a really long time while we were married. I don't think I ever did therapy. And then through our like separation and divorce, we were individually in therapy a lot. And then
that was because you didn't do feelings, remember?
Yeah. I don't like feelings. And then like after divorce and like things settled a little bit, I felt like, okay, I can take a break. And then I've gone like for 2 or 3 sessions here or 2 or 3 sessions there. And like now, like you learn enough in therapy that like for me, I feel like I know like, okay, I'm emotionally okay with this, but my body's holding onto it. So then how do I heal that part? Like you start to become like much more aware of what you're going through.
Right.
And like, do I need therapy to handle this? Do I need,
tools?
What other tools could I possibly use? And for me, sometimes it's like, I don't necessarily need a therapy appointment. I need to fucking move my body and like, get some better sleep and like actually work on myself that way.
I think just to close that up, I think the other part of that is if you're only in therapy one time a week or one time every 2 weeks, and that's the only time you deal with your issues, you're not reading things, you're not journaling, or you're not sort of processing through, it's going to take a long time, just like it would with anything. If you only worked out once a week or once every 2 weeks for an hour, you would never get better, right? And so your investment in your healing is really a big key to the therapeutic process.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Anxiety. I feel like it's like a buzzword. People it has turned into that. It's not. But I think people are like, oh, I have anxiety. I'm having a panic attack. I'm so anxious. And so first and foremost, I think there's a difference between you're having some anxiety and like you have an anxiety disorder.
True.
Is that right?
Yes. There's criteria to meet if you have an anxiety. First of all, we all humans have anxiety. That's your fight or flight instinct. And without it, you would be in a lot of danger. So we all feel anxious at times, but to have an anxiety disorder, to qualify for that, you have certain criteria to meet. And, you have to have certain intrusive thoughts. They last for a certain period of time that interfere with your ability to function. And if you can Google it yourself, but there's 6 different like criteria to meet to have an anxiety disorder. And then there's different types of anxiety, like generalized anxiety, social anxiety. OCD is a higher form of an anxiety. So it is flipped around as if it's just, everybody has it, which they do, but not in a dysfunctional way.
Right. Not in like a way that like you might need to medicate for, or that like you're going into like an intensive therapy for, or whatever. Right. I think, so this is something that, like you said, we all have like dealt with from time to time. For me in my life, like my anxiety has gotten worse over the years. My like feeling of like, I was carefree, footloose in like the 20s. I was like, I don't think about a damn thing. Don't you think?
Well, I think you internalize your anxiety. I don't think you recognize
Okay, I wasn't, but I faked it.
No, but I think your physical,
really?
Your physical body always experienced it. Like you'd throw up, or you would get a stomach
But like,
ache.
I guess you're right. I wasn't able to say I was anxious. I didn't know that I was anxious.
You didn't know you were anxious.
I did not know that I was anxious. I am, let me rephrase that. Wow, I just went to therapy. I got schooled. I have always been anxious in some capacity, but I've internalized it. Anyways, and now like I feel like I can say like I'm feeling really anxious about this, or and I think one of the things that I love about therapy is it brings so much awareness, and sometimes awareness is enough to kind of work through your issues. Be like, wow, I am anxious. Anyways, but I feel like as I've gone through things and as I've gotten older, I'm like, wow, I'm really anxious about my kids. The worst case for my kids, this happening to my kids, or, through my divorce, I was like, well, I'm going to be poor and homeless with 5 kids hanging off of my sagging boobs. Like that's like genuinely how I felt. Actually, I got a boob job before our divorce. Cash that one in. Anyways, but here's a question. Best support for always going to worst case scenario and changing that way of thinking.
So one of the key pieces to this is to recognize that you cannot tell somebody not to feel anxious. That actually creates more anxiety.
It's the meme. So it's like somebody told me not to be anxious and I all of a sudden healed.
Yeah. And so I always kind of highlight the and word, A-N-D. It's like looking at the negative possibilities that could exist and look at the positive possibilities. Look at what negative thing happened and look at what good things came from that. We tend to forget the positive things that happen in our life and focus only on the negative. And so one way to remind people is, again, not to tell them to look at the bright side as a way of dismissing the downside. It's like, I can see why that's concerning. And here's some other things that have happened that are good in your life. And you've overcome these steps. Remember, most people, which is what your case was, just if I can use it as an example, we don't experience a lot of anxiety when we live in our bubble.
No.
It's when we step out of that bubble. So somebody can look like everything is great in their life and they're not anxious because they live a very small world, right? They drive the same streets. They don't ever stretch outside of their comfort zone. So they're not anxious.
Yeah.
That is an avoidant thing. So we can live a very small life without anxiety, but we're never really going to push ourselves to grow because
which is really I could think of 5 people off the top of my head that live that way.
But and my mom was that way, right? I mean, so I look at these, and when you're feeling anxious, it's not always a negative thing. It means you're sort of pushing yourself to try something different. It's reminding yourself that you have the skills, the tools, you have overcome things, because a lot of also our anxiety is tied into past experience. So, if something bad happened, quick example, I work with a high power Microsoft executive who raised his hand in 2nd grade and had the wrong answer, and the kids laughed, and it was so traumatic to him and so anxiety provoking to him that in meetings he refuses to raise his hand at 56 years old, because that feelings don't know time. And so that reaction, the thought of doing that, his body's already in anxiety mode. And so that's the key of getting help and getting therapy, is to realize, it's 2nd grade, that was a big deal. Today, if I say the wrong thing, I hopefully will have enough skill set to recognize it's not that big of a deal. But in 2nd grade, it feels like a really big deal.
Yeah. One of the things, this is like you guys know I love my like random notes and like lists and things. I had such debilitating worst case scenario like anxiety during our divorce that it was like I felt like I couldn't function from time to time. Right. And I would start making calendar notes on my calendar, and I would put, so like, let's say like I got an email from my lawyer that just like set me aside. Or I remember like the day that I lost my lawyer was like, hey, he didn't agree. You can't keep the house. Like, you guys have to sell the house. It's got to go, kind of thing. And that was like one of my like most severe low points. I remember sitting in a conference room sobbing on the phone to my mom. And I don't remember, maybe it was a few weeks later or whatever. I put in my calendar 6 months from that date. And I put 6 months ago, you lost your house, because I wanted to remind myself, look what you've overcome in the 6 months. And I continue to do this. And it is the best reminder, because so often, like you say, like we just forget what we've gone through. Like we move on to the next trauma. We move on to the next piece of anxiety. And like, we forget that like, holy shit, I overcame that. And that was only 6 months ago.
Right.
And like, and it actually wasn't as bad as I made it out to be, or it wasn't, it was traumatic and like scary at the time, but like, look at me now. Like, and so I feel like just little reminders, or, I've told you guys, like, make notes of like all the things you've overcome, or make notes of like
of your skill set.
Yeah.
It's the skill set. It's not just that you overcame something. It's
but like what you learned from it. Yeah.
What skill am I bringing forward? Because the circumstances might look different, which is why people get stuck. They're focused on the circumstance. I lost the house. I lost this. I lost that. But once you recognize I have the skill set to work through a loss, pretty soon you recognize
you sort of feel invincible
resource.
In that sort of scenario.
Then you have skill. You have confidence that you can overcome a variety of things. And by the way, most of my practice is with anxiety and death and dying. And our worst case fear as humans is the loss of a child. And I work with many parents who have lost a child. And to watch them navigate that and come back from that, to me, that's like, I can conquer anything. I like that death and dying stuff, because it reminds me that if these people can get through that, I can get through losing this house. I can get through this change. I can get, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so true. Tips for helping teen girl with anxiety. And another question that came in was like a 4-year-old has anxiety. So they're probably different, but like kids with anxiety, what's your...
One of the things when you're raising kids, I think to be aware of is I help kids recognize sort of the thermometer effect. It's not usually that a kid is anxious just just randomly. So the thermometer is rising. So I'll help a kid recognize, like, they had a rough day at school, and then they didn't sleep well, and then their friend was mad at them. It's like this piling up effect so finally the last thing they're just broken, or a parent, all of us can kind of go through that. And so recognizing what's been adding to that stressor, because what happens, especially for most of us at any age, is that we begin to realize that like we fear the anxiety itself. But if you look backwards and you go, well, it didn't randomly hit you. You were going through this and you tolerated it. Then you were going through this and it just was this big buildup thing. So help them by developing, especially little kids, I give them a toolkit. So like breathing, go with your senses, like maybe a fuzzy blanket, touch, music, hearing, tasting things, smelling things that is like when you're upset, here's what you can go to, is this little box that will help you to calm down. I do it for myself for music. There's some some songs that I can't help but dance to. And when I'm stressing,
she loves to dance.
That's one of the things I will go to.
If you guys are wondering the song, it's Meghan Trainor. I feel better.
Oh my
when
God,
I'm
I love that song forever. It's going to be played at my funeral, just for the record. You can't not dance to that, even if you're grieving. So yes, on the back of my jet ski, that'll be.
She's like, play our song in the car. I'm like, oh, my Spotify doesn't have that song. It must be broke. I'm not sure.
It's on the Kids and I playlist. So,
yeah.
Okay. So consistency is the thing that when you're raising kids, being predictable decreases anxiety. So as a parent, one of the things I will always ask them is like, instead of waiting to build anxiety, like, Mom, can I have a treat? No. Please, Mom, can I please have? No. They're waiting for your reaction. So all that buildup is anxiety. So if you really learn to be consistent, you will decrease your children's anxiety as a general statement. Another thing is helping them to label in their own feelings, and that would usually mean that you have to learn how to label yours, which if you go with Brene Brown, the Atlas of the Heart book is fantastic for identifying and naming what feelings are. She does an incredible job of that. But instead of saying don't worry about something, you're basically telling the child to discount what their intuitive is. And that to me is another big, huge point. You don't say, oh, don't worry, you're going to be fine, because they are already worried. Now you're telling them subconsciously something's wrong with them. Or
they shouldn't be worrying.
That they shouldn't be worrying, or there's no reason for them to worry. And it's very confusing. It's like if you're crying as a parent and your kid says, Mommy, you look upset. I'm fine. Well, you basically just told them that their intuitive is completely wrong. And sadly, they were right. You were upset. Maybe you didn't think that they needed to know why. So validate their feeling. I get that you're afraid. It makes sense you're afraid of Memphis. You're crying down here at, you're alone. And I understand that that's a feeling. That doesn't mean, however, your story that something bad will happen is true. So helping them differentiate between a feeling and a story, as we do for ourselves. I might feel like the world's coming to an end because I lost that house, but it doesn't mean that it will come to an end.
Right.
But you got to validate the feeling before you challenge a story.
And then what, like for older kids, like if they're having anxiety, like, teenagers or whatever, it's like their anxiety is external. It's out of the house. Maybe like it's like at school and they're having, whether it's teachers or school or friend issues or.
Again, instead of telling them to move on and just go find another group of friends, validate their feeling. Remember what it was like to be in their shoes. We so quickly forget as teenagers, that's our world. And it isn't just easy to go up and move no friends. So trying to understand their anxiety, trying to understand what the feeling is behind it, instead of just like hurrying up and coming up with a solution. At that time, when a kid is trying to express any feeling to you, it is not the time for the solution. It's time to validate their feeling first. And when I say validate, I simply mean try to understand it. Try to get more information about what it is they're feeling. Because sometimes just that process helps them to then come up with their own solution.
I struggle with this a little bit because like the kids will be like, I'm so afraid of a tornado. And I'm like, me too. What are we going to do? Like
that would be by the way.
But then the kid, like as a kid, you think your parents are invincible.
Feeling, but you'd say, I understand that feeling. I've been afraid of tornadoes before.
Still am.
And I know that can be really frightening. Here's what we're going to do to make sure that we're as safe as we can be. Now, if you're laying on the floor crying, if you're laying on the floor crying, and now they're trying to fix you, that's a problem. But it's wild to me. Like
it is once you're a parent, you realize like, wow, I really thought my parents were like invincible. Like you were not afraid of shit. Like, and then I watched you last night in my house. There was it wasn't tiny, but it was a cockroach. You would have thought you saw a fucking
I've never
black bear.
seen one. From where I come, we don't have those things, and I stepped on it. It's not and it didn't crunch beneath my feet. It was like it was moving. It was like moving me. I was petrified.
Okay, we can't talk about it anymore because we need to talk. So wrapping up, like sort of talking about anxiety, I think one of the things that I always try to do on the podcast is give people some like sort of takeaway of like, what can I do? Most of the time, some of the times we just gab. But I think if you're somebody that struggles with anxiety, or you're struggling with anxiety in this moment, or just feeling like a little bit out of control, like whether it's your body or your emotions or whatever, I know I have told people on this podcast 100 times, like therapy helps, writing helps. For me, I experience anxiety very physically, like nauseous stomach, headache, sweaty, like just fully like my body takes over. What are like some, like maybe 4 or 5 like key tools that you would say people could write these down, and like if you're having anxiety, do these things first?
Look up somatic, SOMATIC, somatic exercises, because that helps release tension from your body in unique ways. I would listen to meditation tapes. I would practice muscle tension.
Meditation tapes. Meditation on like Spotify or something.
Yeah. Sorry.
Tapes is like an old term, but
sorry. I am 60.
Meditation. I lived and died by meditation.
Yes,
in my
that's
divorce.
really,
like
really,
I was
educate yourself again. Getting an anxiety workbook is really helpful because it gives you something to do about the feelings, and understanding with cognitive behavior. And you can get those on Amazon.
Just anxiety workbook?
Yep. There's a variety of them.
Okay.
And I think tapping can be beneficial. There's again, a lot of this stuff is just free. You can Google it. Tapping can be very beneficial because it helps distract your brain from the anxiety that you're experiencing. Dipping your face in cold water, ice water, can help be a reset. Research has shown that if you stand with your hands above your head, it reduces your cortisol, which is your stress hormone. And taking some deep breaths. It's impossible to have a panic attack if you breathe slowly through your nose. So breathe like counting to 5 and then kind of release it slowly. It's another way to reset your parasympathetic system.
Yeah, face blanching is what we call that, when you dump your face in like ice cold water. Doesn't that reset your nervous system?
Yes.
It is like one of the most life-changing things. It's like you hold your face in ice cold water for 10 seconds. 10 seconds, whatever. And then like repeat a couple times.
And then distraction. If you're in a anxiety, like what I call you're spinning and you're kind of going down the hole, as soon as you recognize that you're doing that, even if you just go distract yourself with something else, because that's not the time you're going to do the thinking. Think of it as the bear is chasing me. I'm not going to be like, I wonder if it can catch me. It's like you're going to get out of the danger, get out of that cycle, and then you can rethink about it later on. And helping somebody else do that can be really beneficial.
Yeah. I also
Listening to somebody during their anxiety is not what's beneficial.
No. I also think moving your body if it's outside, like just a walk or whatever.
30 minutes, another scientific evidence, 30 minutes of a fast-paced walk outside is almost as therapeutic as many of the antidepressants.
Wow.
For some people. And so, but we know for all people, it's very beneficial.
Yeah, for sure. Get your walk on. All right. We are jumping to boundaries. We talked about boundaries in multiple episodes, probably, honestly. One of the quotes that I have repeated a handful of times on this podcast is the people who don't like when you set boundaries are the ones who benefit from you not having them. So boundaries, how would you describe, like, what, if somebody's like, I don't even, like, what do you mean set a boundary? How would you describe that?
Take responsibility for your own feelings and needs instead of projecting it onto somebody else. So if I don't like the way I'm feeling during an interaction with somebody, you put the responsibility for yourself to figure out what can I do to stop that from happening to me. So a boundary is something that you set. I mean, somebody else might set it against you or for you, but many people will set a boundary when they're mad. I'm not talking to that person, but then when the anger comes down, the boundary comes down. A true boundary is one that says, I'm in charge of my body, my persona. I get to decide who hurts me, who's good for me, and
how people treat me.
How many people treat me. I can't control how they treat me. What I can do is sort of remove myself if they're treating me in a way that is too hurtful for me.
Yeah. I posted a Instagram like reel or something that talked about the let them theory, the Mel Robbins. You've heard this and stuff. And somebody was like, yeah, but like, do you just let people treat you like shit? And it's like, no, that's a clue though, that's where you need to set a boundary. If you just let somebody behave the way that like, you know, that they're going to actually behave, like it's a good indicator of like that. I probably need to set a boundary with that person. Otherwise I'm going to try to control how they're treating me. And like,
so not setting a boundary and just going with the flow is a form of control. I want to control how you see me rather than tell you that, you know, somebody might be, I don't like the way they act with me, and it's vulnerable. It's really, really hard to, in my mind, to set that level of a boundary and saying, you know, trying to tell somebody, hey, when you do this, this is how it affects me. And that person, if they care about you, and if it's not something that is against their needs, you know, hopefully you can compromise. But when, like for me, if somebody ignores me, I have to set a boundary with that type of person because it hurts me too much. So I have to distance myself from that. I can't make them communicate in a healthy way with me, but what I can do is to say, that's not the kind of person that I need in my inner circle for myself.
So first question is, how do I create a boundary?
First of all, recognize why you need it. Number one, if you're needing a boundary, it's probably because you're upset or hurt by something that's going on around you, or you're putting, it might be for yourself. Like I have a personal boundary, like used to be when anytime I would go anywhere with somebody and we were ordering food, I would always pay. Nobody knew or nobody paid attention to that. I felt obligated because it was almost like an anxiety reaction. Do they expect me to pay? Should I not? So my boundary is for my own personal growth where I will pay my part and allow them to pay theirs. As a general rule, it's just for certain times I'm practicing that because it used to be not a choice. So that would be a personal boundary. I also made I have a boundary with certain people where I won't allow them to, I won't meet their expectation of me. They may want me to come to their house, or like my mom would do that, you know, guilt me for not coming there. And I learned that the boundary was, I don't like the way I'm treated when I'm there, so I'm not going to be going over there.
Right. So in terms of how to set a boundary, one of the things I think that like it should be clear here is like usually if you're setting a boundary, it's because you've communicated maybe once, twice, 3 times something and nothing has changed, or the situation hasn't improved. And so then it's like, okay, I have to set a boundary here.
You would assume so that would be the first step prior to setting the boundary. In part of setting a boundary is the process of saying to somebody how you feel. You know, when you say this to me, like I gave you some unsolicited advice this morning. You may not even recognize you did.
I did.
Yeah, and you said, so the boundary was, I don't want any input on that, essentially, in a nicer way. But I know that is a tiny boundary. Now, if I pushed up against that, you'd have to set a bigger boundary.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before. This is something that we've
absolutely
settled in our relationship of like, hey, I don't mind you giving me advice, but if there's times where I don't want it, I'm going to tell you.
And sometimes I don't even recognize I'm giving it. And so you're good at saying.
She's a therapist. Go on, please.
Okay. It's really, the part is I care to respond to that. So it doesn't require a humongous talk anymore. And not that it ever did, but I try to honor you in that way. And in return, you can, you know, if you're asking for things, I will say, let me know if I cross that.
Yeah.
So that I also don't walk away feeling like a boundary would not be in that situation where you just don't ask me anymore. That is punishment. That's different.
Yeah, very.
Give somebody the opportunity to honor what you're asking of them. If they refuse, you may go back at it a second time and say, hey, I'm not sure if I made this clear. But a boundary would then look like, I'm not going to talk to you about this. And so like if my mom were to ask me about my friends, I would say, I'm not talking to you about that because you tend to twist my words. So that was the boundary. So I don't have to say I'm setting a boundary. I choose not to talk to you about that stuff.
Yeah. And then setting, like, I think this is more geared in a relationship, setting a boundary with somebody without feeling like it's an ultimatum.
Well, it is an ultimatum. So in reality, if somebody doesn't honor your boundary, my hope for you is that it is an ultimatum, that if somebody continues to do the things to push on your boundary, that the ultimatum might end up being, if you choose to do that, we're not going to have a relationship.
Yeah.
So I do think there can be ultimatums, and there ought to be ultimatums with boundaries, which is, again, I have a job to take care of me, you have a job to take care of you, and our goal is to take care of each other. Mm-hmm. So the ultimatum might be, if you continue to do this, then we're not going to be able to communicate.
Yeah, right, exactly.
As a general rule, while it's a buzzword and people don't like it, I think that we're normalizing a sense of responsibility to take care of ourselves instead of being passive aggressive and using, kind of what we now know as more toxic communication styles. This is a better way, is to actually set a boundary so that we don't have to resort to that.
Yeah, 100% agree. All right, that is another episode of Group Therapy with Nana. Thank you, Mom.
Yes.
There is a couple resources we mentioned, so we'll put those in the show notes if you're on any like podcast streaming platform, just in the show description, basically. And then there is a link now in all of our show descriptions, so you can leave questions if you have questions for Nana on Group Therapy, if you want topics on the podcast, if you want to give me just a super, super sweet review. We will take them all. Compliments, paychecks, any of it, honestly. And you can click that Jot form link, and you can put anything in there, and we'll be back soon. Thanks for listening to The Summer of Me. You can listen to episodes on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can watch on YouTube. Come hang out and follow my chaos on Instagram @KendraForNow. See you next time.